I'll speak fairly briefly so we've got time for a discussion, and I just caught the end of what you were saying there, and I'll come back to the Middle East in a moment. All I would say is that last month I was in Gaza as part of a delegation of 60 parliamentarians from across Europe, from 13 different countries. I mean, imagine the logistics of getting 60 members of parliament together, all of them with complicated diaries, all of them with Blackberries, all of them with mobile phones, all of them with computers, all of them wanting yesterday something else done. So it was a bit of a problem, but we managed it, and we all got in, and spent a couple of days there visiting families, had a long meeting with the United Nations representatives there, John King, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency that is, and a long meeting with the Prime Minister of Gaza, the Hamas leader, and with the other parties except Fatah. And a few things hit me. I've been to Gaza many times. One is that there has been absolutely zero reconstruction work done since a year ago. Nothing, because no material can get through. John Ging explained after 3 months of negotiations he was able to bring in enough wood to make desks for the expanding school population, because the United Nations runs the education service in Gaza, but he wasn't allowed to bring in any metal or any nails or any screws or anything else. So unless you go back to medieval forms of woodwork where you do it all by dovetail joints with dowling, you still need the tools to do it. So it's absurd. Cement is not allowed in, and so people are now building literally mud houses as a way of surviving. And I've met families who are still living in tents donated by the Rotary Club a year ago. They're very good tents, but they don't last that long. I mean, it's ridiculous, the situation. And the other things that hit me on this visit was that, one, the current level of destruction is very big. Secondly, that there were obviously civilian targets attacked, such as a shell attack on a school. You could see the shell marks on the school walls, the upper floors of a secondary school. Indeed, a secondary school that I visited during one election, and I was an observer, there was a polling station in that particular school. And thirdly, that the young people of Gaza, yes, are very angry, yes, are imprisoned, obviously, and can't do anything. But there's also a degree of depression creeping in, and for the first time I've heard problems of drugs and so on amongst young people in Gaza. Not something I've ever come across before. There's always been a very strong sort of sense of self-identity and community there. And that's a product of being in prison. 1.5 million people in a prison with insufficient food and resources, but not starvation, so they can survive, but no more than that. Hopefully, everyone was planting vegetables madly on every last piece of land, and it was quite humbling, really, to see people literally dragging the remains of buildings and shells and things off ground and immediately planting it with vegetables. So you've got vegetable patches surrounded by scrap iron, because they can't do anything with the scrap. So it's depressing, and the long, very long meeting we had, and this was a very much an all-party delegation, both from Britain but also from pretty well all the other 12 other countries in Europe that sent people on it, was that the leadership in Gaza want to talk. They want to be part of a process. They didn't say we recognise the state of Israel. I didn't expect them to. But they said things like, we acknowledge the existence of a different entity. Well, that's as good as you're going to get. You're not going to get any more than that. And so the idea of the Western strategy of dividing Fatah from Hamas, dividing Gaza from the West Bank, is utterly and totally counterproductive. And we've just got to get real and have all-embracing talks, and ministers have got to be prepared to go to Gaza and so on. It's got to go on from there. We can't continue this sort of strategy. And so, am I hopeful about a Middle East peace process? No, I'm not, quite honestly, but I do think some significant changes have happened. Operation Cast Lead, Goldstone Commission, the continuation of the Israeli settlement policy and the way in which, you have to say, they deliberately embarrassed Vice President Biden during his visit, and the changed attitude in the United States, possibly there's going to be something slightly more realistic about this. But a suspension of settlements is not enough. Settlements have got to stop altogether. There has to be that as a basis for it. And just an understanding that if you imprison 1.5 million people, I don't agree with, support, advocate, condone in any way suicide bombs, rocket attacks, F-16 jets, helicopter gunships, or any of that. But if you imprison 1.5 million people, they are going to react in some way. It's inevitable and it's obvious, and there's got to be a changed attitude and approach. So I came back interested, pretty depressed by a lot of it, but also recognising that this is a humanitarian crisis, and if the tunnels didn't exist, there would be total starvation in Gaza. The tunnels do exist, but Egypt is now building an underground wall, if that's not a tortuous explanation. They're building a 20-metre down wall in order to prevent the tunnels going through. The only other example I've ever found of a wall that goes underground is the wall that exists between the two sections of the Milltown Cemetery in Belfast to ensure that the Catholic dead and the Protestant dead cannot consort together. There's a wall separating them. It's absurd. And there has to be a significant change in policy, so we'll come on to that. But the public pressure now for a settlement in the Middle East, the public pressure for Goldstone, the public pressure for war crimes to be investigated, the public pressure for decency and solidarity with the Palestinian people is something that's very good. And also, I think all of us have to reach out to those in Israeli society, in Gush Shalom, in the women's movements, and all the others that are serious about living in the Middle East and being part of the Middle East and recognising Palestine and Palestinian people's rights. And so there's a big agenda there. I'll say a couple of other things, if I may, before I finish, Peter. This week, yesterday, we had the new START treaty agreement between Russia and the United States. And at one level, you think, well, yes, here we are discussing a level of nuclear mutual annihilation that is possible, and therefore you sort of feel, well, hang on a minute, in the 21st century, we should be able to do better than that. But look at it another way. It is extremely significant that these very large cuts that are going to be made, both in missile launches and the number of missiles, and a rather confused, but clearly both sides think they know what they've agreed on, issue of national missile defence has been put forward. And there is some move towards nuclear disarmament as a result of it. And that is a good run-up to both the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which starts in New York in May, and also the conference that Obama is presiding over in 2 weeks' time, or next week I think it is, in Washington, of all nuclear-powered states, because we cannot achieve nuclear disarmament through the non-proliferation process. It is not about disarmament, it's about preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and the requirements of disarmament by the 5 declared members. If we can make some progress there, then there is a possibility of making some wider progress. But there are issues that have to be addressed, and they're not simple. That is that India, Pakistan and North Korea are not signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In the case of India and Pakistan, certainly do possess nuclear weapons, but they are targeted towards each other, and one hopes that they'll be prepared to continue those negotiations. The 6-party talks are resuming. The problem area is Israel's possession of nuclear weapons and the inability of getting a nuclear-free Middle East while Israel possesses nuclear weapons. They haven't ever in terms acknowledged their existence, but they did sign the Mediterranean Declaration 2 years ago, which was about removing weapons of mass destruction from the Mediterranean zone. And it is obviously a provocation to every other country in the region to think about it developing its own nuclear weapons if Israel continues its possession and development of 200 nuclear warheads. Now, I recognise that Iran has a nuclear generating capacity which is developing very fast, has an enrichment capacity which it's developing very fast. It doesn't mean that it has nuclear weapons. It does mean that at some point in the future, they could possibly develop sufficiently to develop some kind of nuclear bomb. They haven't done that as yet, and they're still members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and there have been some quite interesting statements from the religious leadership in Iran which suggest that it would be haram to have nuclear bombs anyway. I think we're of interference somewhere.